Silence disrupts the invisible contract people rely on without ever acknowledging it. In ordinary interactions, there is an unspoken rhythm, expression followed by response, action followed by explanation. People grow comfortable within this predictable exchange because it offers them a sense of control. Words become anchors, stabilizing uncertainty and confirming that what they perceive is aligned with reality. When you participate in this rhythm, you provide others with constant signals that help them interpret not only you but themselves in relation to you. The moment you withdraw your voice, that structure collapses. The absence is not neutral, it is deeply provocative. Without your explanations, others are left without the reference points they unconsciously depend on. What once felt stable begins to shift. Their understanding of your intentions becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is something the human mind resists with remarkable intensity. It seeks resolution, even if that resolution must be invented. External validation plays a crucial role in how people maintain their sense of self. They look for subtle confirmations in tone, in language, in reactions. A simple reply, a casual remark, even a disagreement. These are all forms of feedback that reassure them they are seen, understood, or at least acknowledged. When silence replaces these signals, that reassurance disappears. The absence begins to feel like a void, and the mind instinctively tries to fill it. In this void, people turn to interpretation. They replay past interactions, searching for clues they may have missed. They examine their own behavior, questioning whether they have caused this shift. But this reflection is rarely objective. It is shaped by their insecurities, their desires, and their fears. Someone who fears rejection will interpret your silence as withdrawal or disapproval. Someone who seeks control may perceive it as defiance. Someone who depends on constant connection may experience it as abandonment. What makes this disruption so powerful is that it removes your participation in shaping the narrative. When you speak, you guide perception. You clarify, correct, soften, or intensify meaning. Your words act as boundaries within which others form their understanding. Without them, those boundaries dissolve. Others are left to construct meaning on their own, using only the fragments of their inner world. Silence in this sense is not merely the absence of sound. It is the removal of structure. It denies people the comfort of immediate answers and forces them to confront ambiguity. And ambiguity is fertile ground for projection. The mind begins to create explanations, not because they are accurate, but because they are necessary to restore a sense of balance. This disruption reveals how dependent people are on external cues to maintain their inner stability. It exposes the fragility of the frameworks they use to interpret relationships and interactions. Without your voice to stabilize the exchange, they are left navigating uncertainty with tools that were never meant to function alone. When answers are withheld, the human mind does not remain still. It moves, often restlessly, into the space left behind, attempting to reconstruct what is missing. In that process, it rarely searches for truth in its pure form. Instead, it reaches inward, drawing from personal experiences, emotional patterns, and unresolved conflicts. What emerges is not an understanding of the other person, but a projection of the self disguised as interpretation. Projection is subtle. It does not announce itself as imagination or distortion. It feels real, convincing, even logical. A person does not say, "This is my fear speaking." They say, "This must be the reason." And in that quiet shift, their inner world begins to take the place of external reality. Your silence becomes a surface onto which they cast their expectations, their anxieties, and their unspoken doubts. Someone who carries insecurity may begin to assume they have been judged or rejected. They revisit past moments, searching for evidence to confirm this belief, reshaping neutral interactions into signs of disapproval. A glance becomes meaningful. A pause becomes deliberate. An ordinary conversation becomes loaded with hidden intent. The silence does not create these interpretations. It reveals the framework already present within them. Another person, driven by control, may interpret the same silence as a challenge. They may feel compelled to regain dominance over the situation, to provoke a response, or to impose their own explanation with certainty. In their mind, uncertainty is intolerable, and your silence becomes something to overcome rather than understand. Their reaction is not about your absence of words, but about their inability to exist comfortably without them. There are also those who romanticize the unknown. For them, silence becomes depth, mystery, even superiority. They begin to attribute meaning that elevates you beyond reality, constructing an image that reflects their longing rather than your truth. In this case, projection takes the form of idealization, turning absence into something almost sacred. What unites all these responses is not their accuracy, but their origin. Each interpretation emerges from within, shaped by personal history and emotional conditioning. The mind does not tolerate emptiness. It fills it with familiar patterns. These patterns feel like conclusions, but they are reflections, echoes of what already exists beneath the surface. Your silence acts as a catalyst. It removes the external influence that might otherwise correct or challenge these internal narratives. Without your voice to provide context, there is nothing to interrupt the process. The mind continues building, layer upon layer, until the constructed meaning feels complete. Yet this completeness is an illusion, sustained only by the absence of contradiction. In this way, silence becomes revealing, not because it communicates something directly, but because it allows others to unknowingly express themselves. Their assumptions, their reactions, and their conclusions form a map of their inner landscape. What they believe about your silence becomes a window into how they perceive the world, how they relate to uncertainty, and how they manage the tension between what is known and what is imagined. Each response, no matter how different it appears, carries the same underlying truth. People do not simply react to silence, they reveal themselves through it. Silence has a way of turning attention inward, especially when there is no external voice to engage with or resist. In ordinary circumstances, people move through interactions by focusing outward on conversations, reactions, and the subtle exchange of signals that define social connection. This outward focus acts as a distraction, a continuous flow that keeps deeper introspection at a distance. When that flow is interrupted, when silence replaces engagement, the direction of attention begins to shift. Without external dialogue to occupy the mind, there is nothing left to grasp except one's own thoughts. At first, this may appear as simple curiosity or mild confusion. Questions arise naturally. What changed? What caused it? What does it mean? But as silence persists, these questions deepen and multiply. The mind circles around them, searching for clarity, and in doing so, begins to descend into layers that are usually left unexplored. This inward movement is not always comfortable. Beneath the surface of everyday awareness lies a collection of unresolved emotions, contradictions, and suppressed thoughts. These elements are often kept at bay through constant activity and interaction. Silence removes those barriers. It creates space, and in that space, what was previously ignored begins to surface. A person may begin by examining their actions, replaying past moments with increasing scrutiny. They look for mistakes, for overlooked details, for signs that might explain the silence. But this process rarely remains confined to the surface. It gradually exposes patterns, recurring doubts, familiar insecurities, and persistent questions about self-worth or acceptance. What begins as an attempt to understand another person becomes an encounter with oneself. This confrontation is subtle yet profound. It is not a single realization, but a gradual uncovering. Thoughts that were once fleeting become persistent. Feelings that were once vague take on sharper definition. The absence of external input forces the mind to rely on its own contents, and in doing so, it reveals the structure of those contents. Some may resist this process. They may seek distractions, attempting to restore the outward focus that silence has disrupted. Others may become absorbed in it, drawn deeper into analysis and reflection. In both cases, the silence continues to exert its influence because it has already altered the direction of attention. Once the mind has turned inward, it cannot fully return to its previous state without first passing through what it has uncovered. What makes this inward reflection significant is not the conclusions it produces, but the exposure it creates. It brings into awareness aspects of the self that often operate unnoticed, assumptions about relationships, expectations of others, and hidden dependencies on external validation. These elements shape behavior and perception, yet they remain largely invisible until something disrupts the flow that conceals them. Silence acts as that disruption. It removes the external engagement that sustains habitual patterns and leaves the individual alone with their own mental landscape. In that solitude, the mind becomes both the observer and the observed, navigating through its own complexities without guidance or interruption. This process does not depend on intention or willingness. It unfolds naturally, driven by the mind's need to resolve uncertainty and restore coherence. Yet in attempting to make sense of what is absent, it reveals what is present within, bringing into focus the structures that define how a person thinks, feels, and interprets the world. When people attempt to interpret silence, They often believe they are uncovering something about the person who has withdrawn. They assume their conclusions are directed outward, aimed at understanding intentions, motives, or hidden meanings. Yet what they fail to recognize is that interpretation does not emerge from the silence itself, but from the framework through which they perceive it. In the absence of clear information, the mind turns to its own patterns, using them as a lens to construct meaning. This lens is shaped over time, formed by past experiences, emotional conditioning, and deeply held beliefs about relationships and human behavior. It operates quietly, influencing perception without announcing its presence. When silence appears, this internal system activates automatically, filling in gaps with familiar narratives. What feels like insight is often a reflection of this internal structure, rather than an accurate reading of the external situation. A person who has experienced betrayal may interpret silence as deception or hidden hostility. They may become convinced that something is being concealed, that the absence of words is intentional and calculated. Their conclusion feels justified because it aligns with their past, reinforcing patterns that have already taken root. Another individual, shaped by experiences of neglect, may see the same silence as indifference or abandonment. To them, the lack of response confirms a fear they have carried long before this moment. There are also those who interpret silence through a lens of self-doubt. They may assume fault within themselves. Believing they have caused the withdrawal, their thoughts turn inward, searching for errors or shortcomings that might explain what has happened. In this case, the interpretation is less about the other person and more about their own fragile sense of worth. Silence becomes evidence, not because it inherently holds meaning, but because it fits into an existing narrative. Even positive interpretations follow the same pattern. Someone inclined toward idealization may perceive silence as depth, as a sign of complexity or emotional restraint. They may attribute wisdom or strength where there is simply absence. This response, though seemingly generous, is still rooted in personal inclination. It reflects a desire to find meaning that elevates rather than disturbs. What remains consistent across these variations is that the interpretation reveals the interpreter. Each conclusion is filtered through personal history, shaped by internal biases and emotional tendencies. The silence itself remains unchanged, neutral in its form, yet it becomes a canvas for countless projections. People believe they are describing another person, but they are unknowingly describing themselves. This dynamic exposes the illusion of objectivity in human perception. Individuals often trust their interpretations, treating them as logical outcomes of observation. They rarely question the origin of these conclusions or consider how much of their inner world has influenced the result. Silence disrupts this illusion by removing external clarification, leaving interpretation unchallenged and therefore more revealing. Without the ability to verify or correct their assumptions, people continue to build upon them, reinforcing their initial impressions. These impressions gain strength through repetition, gradually solidifying into belief. Yet the foundation remains internal, constructed from elements that existed long before the silence occurred. In this way, silence does not communicate a fixed meaning. It becomes a mirror shaped by perception, reflecting the unique composition of each observer's inner world, revealing patterns that would otherwise remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary interaction. The absence of explanation does not create emptiness, it creates tension. When something is left unresolved, the mind does not simply accept the gap and move on. It lingers, circling around what is missing, attempting to restore continuity where it has been interrupted. This tension arises from a fundamental need for coherence, the desire to connect cause and effect, to understand why something happened and what it signifies. When that connection is broken, even briefly, it produces a subtle but persistent unease. In ordinary situations, explanation serves as a bridge between events and understanding. It provides closure, even if that closure is incomplete or imperfect. A few words can stabilize perception, allowing the mind to settle into a defined interpretation. Without this bridge, perception remains suspended. The mind continues to search, unable to finalize its conclusions, caught between multiple possibilities that cannot be confirmed or denied. This unresolved state generates pressure. Thoughts begin to repeat, revisiting the same questions from different angles. Each attempt to find an answer leads to another layer of uncertainty. Instead of clarity, there is multiplication of interpretations, of scenarios, of imagined outcomes. The silence does not answer, so the mind compensates by producing more questions than it can resolve. What intensifies this tension is the role of meaning. Human perception is not passive, It actively assigns significance to events, especially those that disrupt expectation. Silence, particularly when it follows interaction or connection, feels meaningful even when its meaning is unclear. The mind resists the idea that it might be neutral or without intention. It searches for depth, for hidden motives, for signals embedded in the absence itself. In this search, meaning is not discovered but constructed. The mind begins to assemble fragments, past conversations, subtle behaviors, emotional impressions, and arranges them into a narrative. This narrative may shift over time, changing as new thoughts emerge or as emotions fluctuate. What remains constant is the effort to transform uncertainty into something structured, something that can be held and understood. The longer the absence persists, the more elaborate these constructions can become. Simple questions evolve into complex interpretations, layered with assumptions that feel increasingly certain despite their uncertain origin. The mind prefers a flawed explanation over none at all, because even an imperfect structure offers relief from the tension of not knowing. This process reveals how deeply meaning is tied to psychological stability. Without explanation, perception becomes fluid, and that fluidity is difficult to tolerate. The mind seeks boundaries, definitions, and conclusions, not necessarily because they are true, but because they provide a sense of order. Silence removes these boundaries, leaving interpretation open and unstable. In this unstable space, emotional responses begin to attach themselves to the meanings being constructed. Anxiety, curiosity, frustration, or even fascination can shape the direction of thought, influencing which interpretations gain prominence. The result is not a single answer, but a shifting landscape of possibilities, each one carrying its own emotional weight. The tension created by this absence does not resolve on its own. It persists, sustained by the mind's continuous effort to close the gap between what is experienced and what is understood, turning silence into a force that generates meaning through the very act of withholding it. Silence, when it is sustained, begins to function as more than absence. It becomes reflective, not in the way a surface passively returns an image, but in the way it compels observation. Without words to guide perception, there is nothing to focus on except what arises within the observer. The attention that would normally be directed outward is redirected inward, and in that redirection, something revealing begins to take shape. A mirror does not create what it shows. It only reveals what is already present. In the same way, silence does not impose meaning. It exposes the meanings that individuals bring with them. When someone encounters silence, they are not simply facing another person's withdrawal. They are encountering the limits of their own understanding, the patterns of their own thought, and the emotional structures that shape how they interpret absence. At first, this reflection is not recognized as such. It feels external, as though the silence itself is communicating something specific. People attempt to decode it, to translate it into intention or message, yet the more they try to define it, the more their own tendencies begin to surface. Their thoughts reveal what they expect, what they fear, and what they believe to be true about relationships and human behavior. For some, this reflection brings discomfort. They begin to notice contradictions within themselves, conflicting interpretations that cannot easily be reconciled. They may shift from certainty to doubt, from confidence to insecurity, without fully understanding why. These shifts are not caused by the silence alone, but by what the silence allows them to see. It removes distraction, leaving them face to face with elements of themselves that are usually obscured. Others may experience a different kind of realization. They may recognize patterns in their thinking, noticing how quickly they assign meaning or how strongly they react to uncertainty. This awareness does not necessarily bring immediate clarity, but it introduces a level of observation that was previously absent. They begin to see not just what they think, but how they think. What makes silence so effective as a mirror is its refusal to interfere. Words can redirect, soften, or challenge perception. They can interrupt assumptions and reshape interpretation. Silence offers no such intervention. It remains still, allowing every thought, every projection, and every emotional response to unfold without resistance. In this way, it creates a space where the internal process becomes fully visible. This visibility can be unsettling because it lacks external confirmation. There is no immediate way to verify whether one's interpretations are accurate. The individual is left alone with their reflections, navigating them without guidance. This isolation intensifies the experience, making each realization feel more immediate and personal. Over time, the mirror effect deepens. Initial reactions give way to more layered observations. What began as simple questioning can evolve into a broader awareness of one's inner landscape, habits of thought, emotional triggers, and underlying assumptions. Silence does not provide answers, but it reveals the process by which answers are formed. In this sense, the mirror is not something separate from the observer. It is created through the interaction between absence and perception, where the lack of external input allows the internal world to emerge with clarity, exposing dimensions of the self that are often hidden beneath the constant noise of interaction.